Like the video, subscribe, and comment your country below so I know who's listening tonight. Turn off the lights and put on headphones for the full horror experience. Let's begin the nightmare. If you're brave enough. Dr. Rafiq Farid had always believed hospitals were built on a thin line between life and death, but he never imagined he would one day feel that line tighten around his throat like a cold, skeletal hand tightening its grip, and on the night the storm knocked out half the city's power, he sensed something wrong in St. Helma Medical Center long before the lights began to flicker and the hall started breathing. Yes, breathing. As if the entire building were an old, dying beast exhaling its last warm breath into its own ribs. Rafiq had stayed late for a double shift, exhausted, sipping cold coffee that tasted of metal while reviewing files in the ICU, when suddenly every monitor in the ward blinked, flatlined for one impossible second, and then resumed as though nothing had happened, except every patient, every unconscious, sedated, or comatose form, turned their heads toward him in perfect synchronization, their eyes still closed but their chests rising in the same unnatural rhythm like puppets sharing a single pulse. He stumbled backward, knocking over a cart, but the moment he blinked, everything was normal again. Patients unmoving, machines humming steadily, lights burning dull yellow above him. Rafiq tried to explain it away as fatigue. 36 hours awake, fueled only by caffeine and stubbornness, but the lingering dread in his stomach felt too sharp, too precise, like a warning. He checked the cameras at the nurse station, fast-forwarding through the feed, and froze when he saw the timestamp glitch. 3:11 a.m., repeating over and over, the same minutes cycling endlessly as shadows moved in ways no human shadow should, stretching along the walls like long fingers reaching for something just out of frame. Then a soft whisper brushed his ear, though no one was behind him, saying his name with a rattling, wet sound, almost like someone drowning while trying to speak. "Rafiq?" He spun, heart slamming, but the hall behind him was empty, only dim emergency lights glowing like dying embers along the floor. The hospital felt too quiet, and that silence carried weight, like the air itself was listening. He walked through the surgical wing, passing locked rooms where tools gleamed under thin sheets of light, scalpels and bone saws laid out as if waiting for hands long gone. Suddenly, a patient chart fell from a shelf, fluttering to his feet. He picked it up and nearly dropped it. Name: Rafiq Farid. Condition: pronounced dead at 3:11 a.m. Cause: massive cardiac arrest. His blood turned to ice. This wasn't a joke. The chart was old, yellowed, stained. Its ink faded like it had been sitting for years. His fingers trembled as he traced the date. December 12th, the same night as today, just 10 years earlier. He tore through the pages, finding nothing but incomprehensible scribbles, and then a photograph fell out, a blurry picture of the ICU, monitors dark, his own body lying on a bed, chest exposed, nurses around him performing CPR. He stumbled back, dizzy, and the hallway flickered as if reacting to his panic. The overhead lights sputtered, humming violently, and then, darkness consumed everything. Rafiq reached for his phone, but its screen glitched, showing static lines and a single phrase repeated endlessly, "You never left." He bolted toward the staircase, hearing footsteps echoing behind him. Slow, dragging, not quite human, scraping the floor like bare heels being forced forward. The emergency stairwell door banged open by itself, slamming so hard the metal beneath his fingers vibrated. Inside, the stairwell lights flickered sporadically, revealing just quick flashes of what waited a floor above. A silhouette hunched over, hands dangling too long, head lolling unnaturally as if its neck were broken. When the light blinked again, it had moved closer, without sound, without steps, just appearing like the darkness itself pushed it forward. Rafiq sprinted down the stairs, lungs burning, but no matter how many steps he descended, the numbers on the walls read the same. Floor 3, ICU repeated every few seconds, as though the staircase had become a looping throat swallowing him again and again. He slammed through a door, desperate, bursting into the morgue. The smell of disinfectant and cold metal slapped him, but something else lingered under it, a sweet, rotting smell like decaying flowers. Drawer doors creaked slowly open by themselves as he stepped in, each metallic slide echoing like a hollow bell. One by one, the sheets peeled back. Every body was staring at him, eyes open, frozen, waiting. He choked on a breath when he saw the last slab pull out, revealing himself, pale, chest stitched from an autopsy incision, eyes wide but unseeing. Yet the corpse's lips curved upward slowly, impossibly, into a thin, mocking smile. The overhead bulbs exploded in a cascade of sparks that showered the floor, plunging the room into a choking, suffocating dark. And in that darkness, his dead counterpart spoke with a voice of cold breath and empty lungs. "Doctor, do you hear it?" Rafik shook violently, gasping, stepping backward until his shoulders hit the wall, and then he felt it, the vibration of hundreds of heartbeats thudding beneath the floor, walls, ceiling, all in perfect synchronization, like the hospital itself was alive and the center of that heartbeat was him. The corpse sat up, bones cracking, head tilting in that unnatural marionette way, whispering, "It's time for your round, doctor." The door behind him slammed shut, locking with a final metallic click that echoed through his skull. Then the alarms throughout the hospital began to blare, flatlines, code blues, emergency calls, all repeating the same thing in a distorted automated voice. "Dr. Rafik Farid, report to the ICU. Time of death, 3:11 a.m. He covered his ears, but the walls themselves repeated the call, vibrating with the words. Then, through a ruptured window in the morgue, Rafik saw something impossible. Outside the hospital, the city was gone, replaced by a black void stretching endlessly, the hospital suspended like a lone island in a sea of nothingness. And in that void, countless pale faces floated, watching him, waiting. The hospital lights flickered once more, and when they came back, the door to the ICU elevator slid open by itself with a cold metallic groan. Inside, dim green light flickered. A shadow waited. A voice beckoned, "Come, doctor. Your patient is waiting." And as the elevator doors closed behind him, sealing him in with darkness, Dr. Rafik realized with absolute bone-splitting terror that he was no longer the one treating the hospital. The hospital was treating him. The elevator descended slowly, each floor passing in a distorted blur of flickering green light, numbers flashing backward, skipping, never showing the ones that mattered, and Dr. Rafik felt a creeping nausea as if the walls themselves were pressing inward, tightening around his chest while the voices of patients long dead, or perhaps never alive, whispered from the corners in the gaps of reality. A chorus of murmurs that rose and fell like waves in a stormy ocean, each word a fragment he couldn't fully comprehend but felt deep in his bones. "Return, doctor. Time is broken. You are ours." The hum of the elevator suddenly pitched into a high, metallic screech, rattling the cab, and when Rafik instinctively reached for the control panel, his fingers met ice-cold metal, pulsing under his touch like it had a heartbeat of its own. The doors opened without warning, revealing a corridor drenched in darkness, far longer than any floor of the hospital should have been, stretching endlessly in both directions, with flickering fluorescent lights that sputtered and cast shadows dancing like grotesque marionettes along the walls. The smell hit him first, a stench of antiseptic mixed with decay, with undertones of something metallic and sharp, a scent that clawed at his throat and lungs, making him gag as he stumbled forward, each step echoing in the endless hall as if 1,000 unseen pairs of eyes were tracking him, observing his movement with cold, patient hunger. The patient rooms were all open, doors swinging slowly, creaking in perfect rhythm with his heartbeat, and within each room, figures lay on the beds, pale, silent, impossibly still. But when he looked closer, the eyes opened, black and empty, reflecting not his face but flickers of something else. Events he had never lived, memories that belonged to strangers, children screaming in hallways that had never existed, nurses performing procedures with hands that were stretched impossibly long, operating without emotion or awareness of the doctor watching. He turned a corner and the floorboards shifted under him, soft and yielding as if he were stepping on flesh instead of tile, and the whispers coalesced into one voice, high and crackling, repeating his name over and over, layering itself in echoes until the sound became physical pressure against his skull, rattling his teeth, his bones, his very sense of time. "Rafik, come to us! The patient waits! The patient remembers!" He ran, stumbling, passing a room that looked exactly like the morgue but different. The cadavers on the slabs were moving now, shifting their limbs, turning heads in unison to follow him with hollow, predatory curiosity, mouths opening silently as if they wanted to speak but could only breathe ice into the room. He tried the doors along the corridor, locked, jammed, or leading to rooms filled with darkness so absolute it seemed to absorb sound, even the thump of his own heart, until he reached a stairwell and descended, hoping to find an exit, but the steps were endless, curling downward like a spiral descending into the bowels of the hospital itself, and at each landing he glimpsed figures at the edges of his vision. Doctors with empty faces, nurses with hair matted in dried blood, patients with gaping wounds that should have been fatal but were alive, staring, following, whispering. When he finally stumbled onto what he thought was the ICU, the monitors were all black, yet the flatline still rang in the air as if the sound of death itself had been recorded and played in a loop, and one monitor flickered briefly to show his own face lying on the bed, eyes wide open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. The voice returned, louder this time, echoing through the corridors and the ceilings, vibrating the walls. "Doctor, you cannot leave. The patient awaits. Your hands are required. Your soul is required." He turned to run, but the hallway behind him stretched impossibly, doors multiplying, shadows bending, shapes shifting in ways that defied geometry, and the air thickened, so cold it felt like needles piercing his lungs, as he realized the hospital itself was alive, breathing around him, reshaping to trap him, feeding on his fear, and from the darkness ahead, the patient emerged. Not a person, not entirely, but a shifting figure of frost and shadow, its body twisting between human and monstrous shapes, limbs elongated, its head tilting at impossible angles, eyes glowing faint white through the black hollows, mouth opening to speak but releasing only a storm of icy wind, carrying whispers of every patient the hospital had ever claimed, every life it had taken or lost. Rafik tried to flee, but the air grew heavy, moving like hands pushing him back, and he could feel the walls closing in, the floors bending under weightless pressure, until he stumbled, crashing to the ground, and the patient loomed over him, staring down with eyes that bore into the marrow of his bones. Then the lights returned in a flash of unbearable white, revealing every detail. The corridor lined with cadavers suspended in midair by invisible force, surgical tools hovering, dripping with liquid that looked like blood mixed with ice, walls etched with symbols he could not recognize but somehow understood, warning him of cycles, of repeated deaths, of endless rounds of torment. The patient spoke again, voice layered, distorted. "Your hands created life, now they will create death. You cannot refuse. You are ours, always ours." The monitors around him sparked violently, electricity arcing into the air, and as the shadows surged forward, swallowing him in black ice and cold that seemed to enter his lungs directly, Rafik realized with bone-shattering clarity that he was not merely trapped in the hospital. He had become part of it, a fixture in its eternal cycle of terror. A doctor condemned to walk corridors that never ended, tending to patients who no longer lived, under the gaze of entities that had no mercy and no understanding of time, repeating endlessly, until all sense of self, all hope, all resistance, were swallowed into the cold, breathing, living nightmare of St. Helma Medical Center, and as he screamed, the walls pulsed, the monitors beeped in unison, and he understood fully the truth he had ignored for decades. Some patients never leave, some doctors never stop treating, and some hospitals are alive, hungry, and eternal. The walls of St. Helma seemed to pulse now, alive with a rhythm that mirrored Rafik's own terrified heartbeat, the monitors around him flickering violently as the patient, neither fully human nor entirely monstrous, hovered, twisting its elongated limbs through the corridor, muttering fragments of words that tore at the edges of his sanity. "Return, return, hands of life, hands of death." and every word vibrated through the very floorboards beneath him as if the hospital itself had become an organ, a living body whose blood was made of electricity and fear. Rafik stumbled backward, crashing into a supply closet, yanking open the door, only to find it empty but for the shelves bending unnaturally, leaning in as if to watch him, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered in a pattern that spelled something on the walls in shadows, letters twisting and writhing until he recognized the words, "You cannot leave." A faint scratching echoed from behind the door, slow, deliberate, scraping like nails over metal, and when he turned, the patient was gone. But the air was alive with whispers, hundreds of voices layered over each other, repeating his name, mocking him, calling him to step into rooms that didn't exist, hallways that curved impossibly, stairs descending into bottomless voids. He ran, guided by instinct and terror, reaching the operating theater, which now stretched far beyond its normal size, walls retreating as if the room were a mouth opening to swallow him whole, and on the metal table lay a body draped in sheets. He recognized it immediately. Himself. Alive, but distorted, chest rising and falling with a rhythm too slow, too deliberate, as if some unseen hand controlled it like a puppet. The voice returned, louder, resonant through the room and inside his own skull. "Doctor, it is time. The patient is waiting. Your hands will serve once more." Sweat froze on his forehead as he approached, unable to stop, compelled by an invisible force, and when he drew the sheet back, the body's eyes opened in perfect synchronization with his own, a mirror image twisted by decades of torment, and the mouth moved, silent at first, then whispering directly into his mind, "Do not resist. Do not. Run. You belong to the hospital." Panic surged, and he lunged to flee, but the room responded like liquid, doors stretching away, walls bending, the operating lights descending low like skeletal fingers, pressing down, and he could feel the smell of antiseptic mixed with something rotting. Dead bodies, long decomposed, yet still moving beneath the skin, writhing, watching, whispering. Suddenly, from the ceiling, surgical tools began to fall, not randomly, but with precision, hovering in the air for fractions of seconds before plunging toward the floor in slow motion, each blade glinting like ice, each movement deliberate, orchestrated by some unseen conductor. He dove to the side, barely escaping, and the reflection in the polished metal instruments caught his eye. He saw not one, but dozens of himself, stretching endlessly into infinity, each Rafik screaming silently, trapped in their own cycle of terror. The patient reappeared, stepping silently across the floor as the lights above flickered, revealing faint outlines of figures crawling out from the walls, from under the floor, from ceilings where no space existed, all watching, all waiting, all murmuring with the same distorted, breathless voice. "You cannot leave! You cannot leave! You cannot leave!" Rafik's vision blurred, his mind splitting under the pressure, and then he found himself in a corridor he did not recognize, though somehow familiar, lined with doors that opened onto memories, each door showing a different nightmarish scene. Children screaming on gurneys, nurses performing procedures on bodies that twitched with life after death, other doctors staring silently at monitors that displayed his own face in endless permutations of death and agony. The voices grew louder, merging into a chorus of shrill metallic screams that made the walls shake, lights explode, and the floor vibrate beneath his feet. Then he heard a slow, deliberate tapping from behind, wood on tile, soft but insistent, measured, almost human, almost patient. He turned, heart hammering, to see dozens of shadows moving independently of their sources, crawling along the walls, lifting from the floor, each shadow shaped like a doctor in a lab coat, but stretching, twisting, limbs longer than nature allowed, faces grotesquely frozen in silent screams, and at their center was the patient, larger now, body composed entirely of shifting shadows and frost, pulsing, alive. Each heartbeat felt in Rafik's chest like a hammer striking bone. It spoke again, its voice layered and impossible. "Time is broken, death is broken, you are broken, serve us, serve forever." He ran, but the hospital now reshaped itself with each step. Hallways curved impossibly, rooms folded into one another, doors leading to infinite repetitions of the same operating theater, the same morgue, the same ICU, each containing a version of himself in a perpetual loop of terror. The floor beneath him gave way suddenly, and he fell into a void of black ice, suspended in darkness with only the faint green glow of monitors floating around him, each screen showing his own face, screaming silently, eyes wide, mouth open in a frozen scream. Then he heard it, a heartbeat, faint but insistent, coming from the darkness itself, growing louder, larger, until the entire void seemed to throb in time with it. Shadows began to rise from the monitors, coalescing into figures, crawling toward him, dragging his own reflection from each screen, hands grabbing, pulling, whispering. "Doctor, doctor, the patient is waiting. Your hands, your hands, your hands." And as the darkness pressed closer, suffocating, vibrating, alive, Rafik understood fully, with terror beyond comprehension, that he had become part of the hospital, part of its endless cycle of death and life, that Saint Helma had claimed him not merely as a doctor, but as an eternal patient, a keeper of the living dead, and the patient, the shadow frost monster that had stalked him since the beginning, stepped forward, towering impossibly high, and whispered one final phrase that echoed through the void, through his mind, through every heartbeat he had ever had. "Welcome home, Dr. Farid. Your round has begun." The hospital warped around Rafik now, corridors stretching impossibly, ceilings bending like molten metal, and every room he passed seemed alive, pulsating in rhythm with his racing heartbeat, yet none of it obeyed logic, as if St. Helma itself had become a sentient maze of fear and memory, breathing, watching, and waiting. The patient, the colossal shifting shadow of frost and broken humanity, followed silently, gliding across the floor without sound, its limbs stretching into corners no geometry should allow, while from the walls emerged countless other figures, pale doctors, nurses, patients, their faces frozen in eternal screams, moving with jerky, unnatural precision, whispering fragments of warnings in voices layered over centuries of torment. "You belong here. The cycle never ends. Hands of life, hands of death. Serve, doctor, serve forever." Rafik ran through the ICU, passing beds filled with people he recognized and didn't recognize simultaneously, faces staring blankly, eyes glowing faintly in the flickering light, monitors beeping with impossible rhythms that synchronized with his pulse, every beep a hammer driving home the realization that the hospital had claimed not just his body but his mind, and that every patient he had treated was now part of this living nightmare, trapped between life and death under the dominion of the entity he could only call the patient. The walls trembled as if the building's very bones were alive, floors rippling beneath him like waves, and he stumbled into the surgical wing, where every instrument floated midair, knives and scalpels spinning slowly, dripping with blood that had no source, each drop freezing in midair before hitting the floor, releasing whispers that filled the air with unbearable static. "Do it! Your hands are needed! You cannot refuse! You belong!" Rafik screamed, pounding the air with fists, but the voices only grew louder, blending into the endless chorus of the trapped, the dead, the dying, each voice layered in a rhythm he could no longer separate from his own heartbeat, until it felt as though the hospital itself was inside his chest, breathing through him, pulsing through him, controlling him. He tried the exit doors, locked, warped, leading instead to endless hallways, each populated by more shadows, more frozen corpses, more whispers repeating his name over and over. "Dr. Farid, your round, your hands, serve us!" Desperation pushed him down the stairs that seemed to spiral infinitely downward, the steps bending into impossible angles, revealing glimpses of rooms beneath rooms beneath rooms, all filled with bodies stitched together in grotesque surgical experiments, eyes staring, mouths moving in silent chants, calling him to join them, to touch them, to take part in the unholy symphony of life twisted by death. A flicker of light revealed the patient standing atop a pile of corpses, taller, larger, limbs extended impossibly, eyes like twin cyclones of snow and shadow, and from its gaping maw, a hurricane of wind and whispers erupted, swirling around Rafik, throwing him against walls that were not walls, ceilings that were not ceilings, the entire hospital reduced to a single, living organism of ice, metal, flesh, and fear. He fell to his knees, vomiting, shaking uncontrollably, every nerve ending screaming as the patient's voice, the voice of storms, of ice, of every soul trapped within St. Helma, poured directly into his mind. Serve, heal, kill, repeat. Your hands are ours, your mind is ours, your soul is ours. And then the ground beneath him split open, revealing a black icy chasm filled with writhing forms, hands reaching upward, mouth screaming silently, eyes wide in unending torment, while above him the patient descended slowly, deliberately, dripping frozen blood and shadows with every movement, and whispered one final command. Perform, Dr. Farid. The cycle begins anew. Rafiq's body rose against his will, arms extending, hands trembling but obeying, stepping forward onto the edge of the abyss where patients of every era and body, every failed procedure and untimely death, floated suspended in ice and darkness, whispering, wailing, reaching for him, and as he bent over, instruments, rising of their own accord, knives and scalpels floating toward his hands, the very hospital itself groaning, breathing, alive, he realized the truth with horrifying clarity. He was no longer the one controlling life and death. He was a vessel, a tool for the endless, living nightmare that St. Helma had become, and as the first cut descended onto the nearest frozen patient, the whispers erupted into a deafening, bone-shattering chorus, and the building shuddered, the lights exploded, shadows collapsed and reformed, and the patient's voice boomed one final eternal decree. Welcome to your eternity, Doctor. Serve forever, serve endlessly, serve the living dead. Rafiq could feel himself slipping entirely, no longer moving through the hospital but becoming part of it, the walls pulsating with his heartbeat, the floors breathing beneath him, monitors floating in midair like eyes, and every patient, past and present, past dead and not yet dead, their faces twisted in silent screams, their eyes following him, all whispering layered, overlapping, unending calls. Doctor! Doctor! Doctor, serve, your hands, your mind, your soul. He stumbled forward, limbs heavy as if filled with lead, yet compelled to continue down a corridor that stretched infinitely in both directions, twisting and turning impossibly, doors opening to reveal horrors that defied memory and physics, bodies stitched together in grotesque anatomical puzzles, nurses with limbs too long, heads rotating to watch him, doctors with eyes that reflected not him but 1,000 versions of his own death, each screaming silently, each beckoning him toward surgical tables that were alive, writhing, waiting to be touched. The patient, the enormous shifting figure of frost and shadow that had followed him since the first elevator ride, hovered above, impossibly massive, pulsing with power, dripping ice and darkness, its voice layered and omnipresent. It is time. Your hands, your mind, your soul. The cycle renews. You belong. You serve. You cannot refuse. Rafiq tried to run, but the hallways folded around him, stretching endlessly, turning back on themselves, stairwells twisting into impossible spirals, and each floor became a mirror of the last, showing rooms where he had died countless times, bodies of himself sprawled across slabs, monitors flickering, beeping, flatlining in endless loops. Surgical instruments floated toward him, spinning in the air, dripping with blackened blood and frost, some moving independently as if alive, some orbiting his body, others stabbing at walls, all guided by the patient's will. He screamed, the sound swallowed instantly by the walls, which bent closer, walls turning into ceilings, ceilings folding into floors, and the shadows that had once been human now climbed over each other, forming a massive writhing mass behind him, mouths opening and closing silently, eyes shining with a cold white light, all whispering, "Serve, heal, kill, repeat. The cycle never ends. You cannot leave." The air grew impossibly cold, every breath burning his lungs, frost forming instantly on his skin, spreading across his clothes, creeping into his eyes, and the monitors now showed hundreds of versions of him performing surgeries, tending to patients, killing and healing simultaneously, each movement dictated by the unseen force of the hospital, as if time itself had become a loop of infinite suffering, each second stretching into eternity. He tried to resist, to fight, but his limbs obeyed anyway, raising, bending, moving toward the nearest table where a frozen, pale patient floated suspended midair, eyes wide, body twitching unnaturally, and as his hands closed around the instruments, the patient loomed even closer, voice booming, "Your round begins, forever, forever, forever." The entire building shook violently, lights exploding into shards of green and white, shadows collapsing then reassembling, walls twisting, ceilings falling, the floor beneath him giving way into a black abyss filled with writhing hands, faces, screaming mouths, and yet somehow, impossibly, he remained standing, compelled, trapped, a puppet of ice and shadow. The whispers intensified, layering until they became unbearable. "Do not resist, do not fight, serve, serve, serve." And then the patient extended a massive, elongated hand, shadows flowing from its body to merge with Rafiq's own, entering his chest, controlling his heartbeat, filling his lungs, reshaping his mind. He realized then, with bone-cracking terror, that the hospital had claimed him not as a man but as a vessel, a living instrument to continue its eternal cycle of life twisted into death, to maintain the unholy balance between patient and executioner. And as he lowered the scalpel to the frozen patient on the table, the voices rose into a deafening crescendo, monitors flashing, walls bending, shadows screaming in unison, and every pulse of the building, the floors, the ceilings, the very walls, pounded in perfect rhythm with his own now enslaved heart, until he understood with finality that he had become the patient, the executioner, the eternal doctor of St. Helma, and the hospital's unending nightmare, whispering one last omnipresent truth into his mind that echoed through every corridor, every shadow, every frozen face. "Welcome to eternity, Dr. Farid. Serve, heal, kill, repeat, forever."